Open your Bible to the New Testament. You will see 4 names acting as the pillars of everything that follows: the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel according to Luke, the Gospel according to John. You probably grew up believing that these 4 men sat down with ink and parchment and wrote the eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus. But if you walk into the Institute for New Testament Textual Research and look at the oldest surviving papyrus fragments of these texts, documents dating back to the 1st and early 2nd centuries, you will notice something terrifying. The names are not there. They were never there. The titles were added more than 100 years later. When the investigative researcher J.J. Benitez started digging into the historical timeline of early Christianity, he found a paper trail that the Church rarely talks about. A trail showing that the greatest story ever told was originally written by people who never signed their work. And it forces you to ask the questions that haunted me for years. Is everything I was taught in church about the origins of the Bible just a pious myth? If the eyewitnesses did not write the Gospels, who actually created the story of Jesus that I have believed my whole life? Now that I know the original manuscripts were anonymous, I cannot unsee how much authority was fabricated later. Before we continue this investigation, leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. This is very important for the algorithm to understand that this type of historical deep dive has value, and it is what allows me to keep opening archives that very few channels have the courage to open, bringing you these stories that were quietly erased from the Sunday school textbooks. For 12 years, I stood at the front of a classroom in a Catholic school in Evansville, Indiana. 12 cold Midwestern winters. 12 years of holding a chalk piece in my hand, drawing timelines on a green board, and telling rows of teenagers exactly how the New Testament came to be. I taught them what I had been taught. I taught them that Matthew was the tax collector who wrote down what he saw. I taught them that John was the beloved disciple who wrote his gospel as an old man in Ephesus. I was so certain. I had the official curriculum, the approved textbooks, the weight of a 2,000-year-old institution backing every word I said. Then, one afternoon in the teacher's lounge, a Hispanic colleague saw me reading a standard commentary on the Gospels. He sat across from me, slid a book across the table, and said I should look at how J.J. Benitez approaches the historical Jesus. He told me that Benitez does not treat the texts as untouchable relics dropped from heaven. He treats them as an archaeological site. You have to dig through the layers of dirt and human intervention to find what is actually buried underneath. I took the book home. I started reading. And that is when the first crack appeared in the foundation of everything I thought I knew. I started looking beyond the approved seminary summaries. I started looking at the actual raw data of manuscript history. Let me take you to a specific room, the Institute for New Testament Textual Research in Münster, Germany. Inside their climate-controlled vaults, they have records and high-resolution scans of the earliest physical evidence of the Christian faith, the oldest fragments of the New Testament we possess. We are talking about Papyrus 52, Papyrus 46, and the Bodmer Papyrus 75. These are pieces of papyrus that date back to the late 1st century and the 2nd century. Some are barely the size of a credit card. Some are larger, brownish, with fading Greek ink. If you look at these earliest surviving fragments, there is a glaring absence. None of them have title pages. None of them say the Gospel according to Matthew or the Gospel according to John. They are completely anonymous narratives. The authors never identified themselves in the text. They never wrote, "I, Matthew, saw this happen." They wrote in the 3rd person. They wrote anonymously. But here is where the story turns. It was not just an accident of lost title pages. The early Christian community itself did not know these books by those 4 names. We know this because of a man named Justin Martyr. In the year 155, Justin was living in Rome. The Roman Empire was hostile to this new sect, and Justin wrote a famous defense of the Christian faith addressed to the Emperor Antoninus Pius. It is called the First Apology. In this document, and in his other writings like the Dialogue with Trypho, Justin quotes extensively from the texts we now call the Gospels. He mentions the words of Jesus, He describes the miracles. But Justin never once uses the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Not once. When he refers to the written accounts of Jesus, he uses a specific Greek phrase, apomnemoneomataton apostolon, the Memoirs of the Apostles. He refers to them collectively. He treats them as a shared anonymous tradition. This is the year 155, over a century after the crucifixion. And the most prominent Christian defender in Rome still does not attach individual names to these books. Because of this, you have to ask a terrifying question. If the authors were anonymous and the early church leaders in the mid-2nd century did not use these names, when did the names appear? The answer is documented. The uniform titles only began to be standardized between the years 150 and 180. The scholar Martin Hengel demonstrated this in his research on the physical codices. As the early Christian communities spread across the Mediterranean, they began collecting these different anonymous scrolls and binding them together into a single book format called a codex. When you have 4 different anonymous accounts of the life of Jesus bound in the same book, you have a practical problem. You need a way to tell them apart. You need external labels. Picture the scribe doing this work. Not a forger hunched in a dark room. A librarian, really, somewhere in Asia Minor or Rome, holding 4 unlabeled scrolls that all tell variations of the same story. He has to shelve them. He has to catalog them. He needs a heading for each one, the same way you would write a spine label on an unmarked book. That practical, almost bureaucratic need is where the first labels were born, decades before Irenaeus ever fixed them permanently. The sacred crashing into the mundane, a filing problem that became a doctrine. But they did not just pick any names randomly. The names were assigned to create a fortress. This brings us to the year 180 in the city of Lyons, in what is now modern-day France. The church father Irenaeus of Lyons was facing a massive crisis. The Christian world was fracturing. There were dozens of competing anonymous texts circulating across the Mediterranean. There was the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Truth. Different factions were using different texts to claim the true legacy of Jesus. A prominent leader named Martyr had even tried to throw out the entire Old Testament and keep only a heavily edited version of Luke. Irenaeus needed to establish unity. He needed to build a wall around the Orthodox faith. So in his massive work, Against Heresies, Book 3, Chapter 11, Irenaeus made a declaration that changed history. He declared that there could be neither more nor fewer than 4 Gospels. His reasoning was not based on historical investigation. His reasoning was cosmological. He wrote that just as there are 4 winds of the earth and 4 corners of the world and 4 faces of the cherubim, there must be exactly 4 pillars of the church. Sit with that for a second. A bishop in Roman Gaul, writing by lamplight, looked up at the 4 cardinal directions of the wind and decided that was proof enough, not a signed letter, not a surviving eyewitness testimony. Wind. That is the argument that permanently welded the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John onto 4 selected anonymous texts. It was a move to consolidate apostolic authority and shut out the competing narratives, dressed up in the language of cosmic order. It was in this moment, in the late 2nd century, that the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were formally and permanently fixed onto these 4 selected anonymous texts. It was a move to consolidate apostolic authority and shut out the competing narratives. When I first learned this, sitting in my small study in Evansville with snow falling outside the window, I felt physically sick. I felt like the foundation of my faith was a lie. I felt like I had been lied to by every priest, every professor, every textbook I had ever trusted. I actually walked into the administration office of my school a few weeks later and asked the principal why we were not teaching the kids that the Gospels were originally anonymous, why we were hiding the fact that the titles were added by Irenaeus in the year 180. The principal looked at me, closed his office door, and told me that my job was to teach the faith, not to confuse the students with academic theories. That was the beginning of the end of my career there. The institution that taught me to seek the truth punished me when I actually found it. I remember the exact texture of that conversation more than I remember most of the last decade. The office smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner. There was a crucifix on the wall behind his desk, slightly crooked, the kind that had probably hung there since the building opened in the 1960s. He did not raise his voice. That was the worst part. He spoke to me the way you speak to a child who has said something embarrassing at a dinner party, calm, a little pitying, absolutely immovable. He told me the diocese had a curriculum committee, and that curriculum committee had not approved any unit on the anonymous authorship of the Gospels, and it was not going to, because parents did not send their children to a Catholic school to be told their faith rested on documents historians could not fully verify. I remember asking him one more question before I left that office. I asked him whether he personally believed the 4 names were literally accurate. He looked at me for a long moment, and he said, "It does not matter what I believe. It matters what we teach." I have never forgotten that sentence. It matters what we teach, not what is true. I did not quit that same week. I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story where I storm out in righteous fury makes for a better highlight reel. But it is not what happened. I stayed for another 8 months. I taught the same curriculum, the same poster on the wall, the same 4 symbols. While every night I went home and read deeper into the manuscript evidence, the codex history, the letters of Irenaeus, feeling like a man leading a double life. I would stand in front of my students during the day reciting the official version and then sit at my kitchen table at night taking notes on why that version could not be historically true. That contradiction is what finally broke something in me. Not one dramatic confrontation, but 8 months of quietly lying to teenagers who trusted me. I submitted my resignation letter in June, at the end of the school year, so I would not leave my classes without a teacher mid-semester. Even walking away, I could not stop being the responsible one. Here is the detail that still keeps me up some nights. Years earlier, before I had ever heard the name Irenaeus, I stood in front of my sophomore class and taught a unit called the 4 Evangelists. I had a poster on the wall. 4 faces, 4 symbols, a winged man for Matthew, a lion for Mark, an ox for Luke, an eagle for John. I told 15-year-olds that those 4 faces were drawn from the vision in the book of Revelation, that God himself had signaled these 4 men as the chosen witnesses. I did not know I was teaching Irenaeus' cosmology as if it were scripture handed down from heaven. I was repeating a rhetorical argument from a bishop fighting a turf war in the year 180 and presenting it to children as settled fact. When I finally understood what I had done, I went back and found that old poster rolled up in a supply closet. I could not throw it away. I still have it. I thought the anonymity of the texts destroyed their value. I thought that if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not put pen to paper, the whole thing was a massive historical fraud. But I was looking at the ancient world through the lens of modern copyright law, and that is a mistake. To understand what actually happened, we have to look at the work of researchers who study ancient literary conventions. We have to look at a concept called pseudepigraphy. The scholar Bart Ehrman explains this clearly. In antiquity, attributing an anonymous text to a famous figure was not always a malicious forgery. It was often an accepted literary convention. It was called honored attribution. If you were a second-generation Christian community writing down the oral traditions of your founders, you did not sign your own name. You signed the name of the authority figure whose tradition you were preserving. You wrote in their name to honor them and to give the text the weight it needed to survive in a hostile world. Think about it. If the early church in the year 180 just wanted to invent the most powerful authors possible to win a theological war, they would have assigned the Gospels to the absolute highest authorities. They would have named them the Gospel of Peter, the chief apostle, or the Gospel of James, the brother of Jesus. But they did not. they assigned two of the Gospels to relatively minor figures, Mark and Luke. Why? Because the tradition was not entirely invented out of thin air. It was a deliberate chain of legitimacy. Mark was claimed to be the interpreter of Peter. Luke was claimed to be the traveling companion of Paul. By attaching those specific names, they anchored the texts to the supreme apostolic authority of Peter and Paul without claiming that Peter and Paul wrote them directly. It was a sophisticated theological strategy. Now, some apologists will point to a man named Papias of Hierapolis. Around the year 130, Papias wrote that Matthew compiled the sayings of Jesus, and Mark wrote down the memories of Peter. For centuries, the Church used Papias as the ultimate proof that Matthew and Mark wrote the books we have today. But here is what the official version leaves out. When you actually read what Papias wrote, his descriptions do not match the books in our Bible. Papias explicitly states that Matthew compiled the sayings of Jesus in the Hebrew or Aramaic language, but the Gospel of Matthew in our New Testament was not written in Hebrew or Aramaic. It was written natively in Greek, and it copies massive portions of the Gospel of Mark word for word in Greek. Papias also describes Mark as writing down the unorganized, scattered memories of Peter. But the canonical Gospel of Mark is a highly structured, tightly woven literary narrative. The books that Papias described are not the books that carry those names today. Remember that credit card-sized fragment I mentioned earlier, Papyrus 52, sitting behind climate-controlled glass in a vault in Manchester, England. It is small enough to fit in your palm. A few lines of the Gospel of John, copied by an unknown hand sometime in the first half of the 2nd century. No title, no signature, no claim of authorship anywhere on the fragment. That tiny scrap of papyrus is older than every single manuscript that carries the name John on its title page. The oldest physical evidence we have of that gospel predates its own byline by decades. There is also a question rarely asked out loud in Sunday school, one that any honest historian has to sit with. If the Church in the 2nd century wanted to invent unshakable eyewitness credibility, why assign a gospel to Mark and Luke at all? Men who were not even among the 12 apostles. Why not simply write Peter's name on the cover and be done with it? The answer historians point to is almost anticlimactic, because the traditions attaching Mark to Peter and Luke to Paul were already circulating informally in local communities before Irenaeus ever wrote a word. He was not inventing authorship out of nothing. He was formalizing and weaponizing a patchwork of oral tradition that already existed, choosing the 4 accounts that best served the unity he needed, and locking their existing nicknames into permanent doctrine. And this is where the manuscript evidence becomes undeniable rather than merely suggestive. Every single title page that survives from before, roughly the year 180, is missing. Not damaged, not partially legible. Missing because it was never there. The uniform superscription formula, Kata Markon, according to Mark, Kata Lucan, according to Luke, only begins appearing consistently once manuscripts start being bound together in the codex format that made a labeling system necessary in the first place. The Bodmer Papyrus 75, dated between 175 and 225, is among the earliest manuscripts where we start to see this titling convention solidify. Before that window, there is a documented, catalogued, photographed silence. There is one more layer to this investigation that most documentaries skip entirely because it complicates the tidy story of a single villain bishop inventing everything in one afternoon. The 4 Gospels were not written all at once, and they were not written in isolation from each other. Modern textual scholars, using something called source criticism, have shown that the Gospel of Mark was almost certainly written first, sometime around the year 70, close to the destruction of the Jerusalem temple by Roman forces. Matthew and Luke, written perhaps 10 to 20 years later, both appear to have used Mark as a source text, copying entire passages nearly word for word, then adding their own material on top of it. John, the last of the 4, stands apart stylistically, written perhaps as late as the year 90 or 100, with a theological vocabulary that reads almost like a different genre entirely. Think about what that timeline actually means. If Matthew the tax collector had personally witnessed the ministry of Jesus, why would he need to copy his account almost verbatim from Mark, a man tradition says was never even one of the 12 apostles, and who, by every early account, was simply relaying second-hand stories from Peter? An eyewitness does not plagiarize a second-hand account. A community compiling and editing shared oral tradition does exactly that, borrowing, expanding, and reshaping a common core text to fit the needs of a new audience. The literary relationship between these books, visible today by simply laying the Greek texts side by side in parallel columns, is itself a kind of fingerprint. It tells you these were not 4 independent witnesses standing in 4 different corners of Judea, writing down what their own eyes saw. It tells you these were 4 editorial projects, each one building on what came before. And here is a detail that made my hands genuinely shake the first time I sat with it in my study. The oldest of the 4, Mark, never had the word gospel in its opening line as we picture it now. The Greek word euangelion, good news, in Mark's opening line simply announced the beginning of the good news about Jesus Christ, not the title of a book credited to a specific author. The word gospel only became a book title, a literary genre label attached to a named individual, once the codex binding problem I described earlier forced someone to write labels on the spine. You are looking at the transformation of a phrase, the beginning of good news, into a legal-sounding attribution, according to Mark, and that transformation happened gradually, invisibly, over roughly a century, with no single scribe ever standing up and announcing that a fraud was underway. That absence of a single guilty party is, in a strange way, more unsettling than if there had been one. Nobody lied. The system simply needed labels, and the labels calcified into scripture. When you pull all these pieces of evidence together, the official Sunday school version crumbles completely. The earliest manuscripts have no titles. The earliest defenders of the faith, like Justin Martyr, do not use the names. The titles only become standardized when the books are bound together. The names are finalized by Irenaeus in the year 180 to fight off heretics, and the earliest testimony we have about Matthew and Mark describes completely different books. I know how much this hurts to hear if you grew up in the church. I lived that pain. But the truth is always better than a comfortable illusion. The Gospels were not written by 4 men taking dictation from heaven. They were oral traditions, stories, and memories passed down through decades of persecution. They were compiled, edited, and written down anonymously by highly educated Greek-speaking Christians 40 to 60 years after the crucifixion. The names were added later to protect the texts, to give them apostolic authority, and to unify a fractured church. This does not mean the texts are worthless. It means they are human. They are the scars of a community trying to survive and trying to hold on to the memory of their founder. The text was not revealed from the clouds. It was constructed on the ground. I want to be careful here because this is exactly the point where some corners of the internet take this kind of investigation and twist it into something it is not. This is not proof of a conspiracy where sinister men in a back room fabricated Christianity from nothing. Pseudepigraphy, honored attribution, was not considered dishonest in the ancient Mediterranean world the way we consider plagiarism dishonest today. Students in philosophical schools regularly wrote treatises in the name of their teacher, decades after that teacher had died, as a way of saying, "This is what our tradition holds. This is what the master would have taught." Jewish apocalyptic literature from the same era did this constantly. Entire books written in the voice of Enoch or Solomon centuries after those figures had lived, and nobody within that culture considered it fraud. It was reverence expressed through borrowed authority. When Irenaeus fixed the 4 names in place, he was not lying in the way we would define lying today. He was doing what religious institutions have always done, taking a living, breathing, somewhat chaotic oral tradition and freezing it into a shape that could survive persecution, schism, and the passage of centuries. J. Benitez himself has never argued that the Gospels are worthless because of this. He argues the opposite, that once you strip away the false certainty of eyewitness authorship, you are left with something more interesting, a set of texts written by a wounded, determined community trying desperately to preserve the memory of a man who upended their entire understanding of the world. That is not a smaller story. It might actually be a larger one. I think about that poster still rolled up in my closet sometimes. The winged man, the lion, the ox, the eagle. For years I thought that image was proof of divine design. Now I understand it as something else entirely. A snapshot of one bishop's argument that won, simply because it outlasted the alternatives. Marcion's stripped-down gospel lost. The gospel of Thomas lost. The gospel of Peter lost. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John survived, not because a committee of witnesses signed a notarized document, but because Irenaeus needed exactly 4 wins, and 4 became the number history remembered. And that brings us to the verdict. The books you read were not signed by the men whose names are on the cover, because authority in the ancient church was not something you inherited. It was something you had to build. If you have stayed with me this far, I want to take a moment to speak to you directly. You just saw how much history is buried under the official narrative. You saw how the institutions we trusted simplified the truth to maintain control. My mission on this channel is to keep digging, to keep bringing you the evidence that they left out of the curriculum. But I cannot do this alone. If this kind of deep historical investigation matters to you, I want to ask you to consider using the Super Thanks button below this video. Your support is not just a donation. It is an act of rebellion against the sanitized versions of history. It is what funds the late nights of research, the access to archives, and the independence to tell the truth without answering to any institution. You are not just a viewer. You are an ally in the search for what actually happened. Thank you to everyone who chooses to support this mission. Now, I want to hear from you. Finding this out changed the trajectory of my entire life and career. Tell me in the comments, what was your experience when you first learned that the Gospels were originally anonymous? Did it destroy your faith? Or did it make the history feel more real? Let me know down below. And if you want to dig even deeper into how historical texts have been debated, questioned, and preserved over the centuries, check out the pinned comment. The Spinoza Forever Library is an incredible resource for anyone who refuses to settle for the simple answers. The pinned comment has the full picture. I will see you in the next investigation.